Another cup of cocoa, another night by the tree, and another 2 chapters of The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. We begin tonight at Chapter 3, The Favorite. The truth is, Maria was unwilling to leave the table then, because she had discovered something upon it which no one yet had remarked upon. By the marching out of Fred's hussars, who had been drawn up close to the tree, a curious little man came into view who stood there silent and retired, as if he were waiting patiently for his turn to be noticed. It must be confessed, a great deal could not be said in favor of the beauty of his figure, for not only was his rather broad, stout body out of all proportion to the little slim legs that carried it, but his head was by far too large for either. A genteel dress went a great way to compensate for these defects, and this led to believe that he must be a man of taste and good breeding. He wore a hussar's jacket, a beautiful bright violet, fastened together with white loops and buttons, pantaloons of exactly the same color, and the neatest boots that had ever graced the foot of a student or an officer. They fitted as tight to his little legs as if they were painted upon them. It was laughable to see that in addition to this handsome apparel, he had hung upon his back a narrow, clumsy cloak that looked as if it were made of wood, and upon his head he wore a woodsman's cap. But Maria remembered that Godfather Drosselmeier wore an old shabby cloak and an old ugly cap, and he was still a dear, dear godfather. Maria could not help thinking also that even if Godfather Drosselmeier were, in other respects, as well dressed as this little fellow, yet he would not look half as handsome as he is. The longer Maria gazed upon the little man whom she had taken a liking to at first sight, the more she was sensible about how much good nature and friendliness was expressed in his features. Nothing but kindness and benevolence shone in his clear green, though somewhat too prominent eyes. It was very becoming to the man that he wore about his chin a nicely trimmed beard of white cotton, for by this the sweet smile upon his deep red lips was rendered much more striking. "Ah, dear father," exclaimed Maria at last, "to whom belongs that charming little man by the tree?" "He shall work industriously for you all, dear child," said her father. "He can crack the hardest nuts in the land with his teeth, and he belongs to you as well as Louise, and to you as well, Fred." With these words her father took him carefully from the table and raised up his wooden cloak, whereupon the little man stretched his mouth wide open and showed 2 rows of very sharp white teeth. At her father's bidding, Maria put in a nut, and crack! The man had bitten it in 2, so that the shell fell off, and Maria caught the sweet kernel in her hand. Maria and the other 2 children were now informed that this dainty little man came with the family name of Nutcracker, and practiced the profession of his forefathers. Maria was overjoyed at what she had heard, and her father said, "Dear Maria, since friend Nutcracker is so great a favorite with you, I shall place him under your particular care and keeping, although, as I said before, Louise and Fred shall have as much a right to his services as you." Maria immediately took him in her arms, and sent him to cracking nuts, but she picked out the smallest, that the little fellow need not stretch his mouth so wide open, which in truth was not very becoming of him. Louise sat down by her, and friend Nutcracker must have performed the same service for her too, which he seemed to do quite willingly, for he kept smiling all the while very pleasantly. In the meantime, Fred had become quite tired of riding and parading his hussars, and when he heard the nuts crack so merrily, he ran to his sisters, and laughed very heartily at the droll little man, who now, since Fred must have a share in the sport, passed from hand to hand, and thus there was no end to his labor. Fred always chose the biggest and hardest nuts, when, at all once, crack, crack, it went, and 3 teeth fell out of the Nutcracker's mouth, and his whole jaw became loose and rickety. "Oh, my poor dear Nutcracker," said Maria, and snatched him out of Fred's hands. "That's a stupid fellow," said Fred. "He wants to be a Nutcracker and has poor teeth. He doesn't understand his trade. Give him to me, Maria. He shall crack nuts for me if he loses all his teeth and his whole chin to the bargain. Why make such a fuss about such a fellow?" "No, no," exclaimed Maria, weeping. "You shall not have my dear Nutcracker. See how sorrowfully he looks at me, and shows me his poor mouth. But you are a hard-hearted fellow. You beat your horses, yes, and you lately have had one of your soldiers shot through the head." "That's all right," said Fred, "though you don't understand it. But Nutcracker belongs as much to me as he does to you, so let me have him." Maria began to cry bitterly, and rolled up the sick Nutcracker as quickly as she could in her little pocket handkerchief. Their parents now came up with Godfather Drosselmeier. The latter, to Maria's great distress, took Fred's part, but their father said, "I have placed Nutcracker expressly under Maria's protection, and, as I see that he is now greatly in need of it, I give her full authority over him, and no one must dispute it. Besides, I wonder at Fred that he should require farther duty from one who has been maimed in service. As a good soldier, he ought to know that the wounded are not expected to take their place in the ranks." Fred was much ashamed, and without troubling himself further about nuts or the Nutcracker, stole around to the opposite end of the table where his hussars, after stationing suitable outposts, had encamped for the night. Maria had collected together the Nutcracker's lost teeth, tied up his wounded chin, and with a nice white ribbon at that, which she had taken from her dress. Then she had wrapped the little fellow more carefully than ever in her handkerchief, for he looked very pale and frightened. Thus she held him, rocking him in her arms like a little child, while she looked over the beautiful pictures of the new picture book, which she had found amongst her other Christmas gifts. Contrary to her usual disposition, she showed some ill temper towards Father Drosselmeier, who kept continually laughing at her, and asked again and again how it was that she liked to caress such an ugly little fellow. That singular comparison with Drosselmeier which she had made when her eyes first fell upon the Nutcracker now came again to her mind, and she said very seriously, "Who knows, dear godfather, if you were dressed like my sweet Nutcracker and had such bright little boots, who knows but you would then be as handsome as he is?" Maria could not tell why her parents laughed so loudly at this, and why the councillor's face turned so red, and he, for his part, did not laugh so half-heartedly this time as he had done more than once before. It is likely there was some particular reason for it. Chapter 4. Wonders upon Wonders. In the sitting room of the doctor's house, just as you enter the room, there stands on the left hand, close against the wall, a high glass case in which the children preserve all the beautiful things which are given to them every year. Louise was quite a little girl when her father had had the case made by a skillful joiner, who set it in such large clear panes of glass, and arranged all the parts so well, that everything looked much brighter and handsomer when on its shelves than when in the hands. On the upper shelf, which Fred and Maria were unable to reach, stood all of Godfather Drosselmeier's curious machines. Immediately below this was a shelf for the picture books. The two lower shelves Maria and Fred filled up as they pleased, but it always happened that Maria used the lower one as a house for her dolls, while Fred, on the contrary, contained his troops in the one above. And so it happened today, for while Fred sat his hussars in order above, Maria, having laid Miss Trutchen aside, and having installed the new sweetly dressed doll in her best furnished chamber below, had invited herself to tea with her. I have said the chamber was well furnished, and it is true. Here was a nice chintz sofa and several tiny chairs. There stood a tea table, but above all there was a clean white little bed for her doll to repose upon. All these little things were arranged in one corner of the glass case, the sides of which were hung with gay pictures, and very readily will be supposed that in such a chamber the new doll, Miss Clara, must have found herself very comfortable. It was now late in the evening, and night, indeed, was close at hand, and Godfather Drosselmeier had long since gone home, yet the children still could not leave the glass case, although their mother repeatedly told them that it was high time to go to bed. "It is true," cried Fred at last, "the poor fellows," meaning his hussars, would like to get a little rest, and as long as I am here, none of them will dare to nod. I know that much." With these words, he went up to bed, but Maria begged very hard. "Only leave me here a little while longer, dear mother. I have 2 or 3 things to attend to, and when they're done, I will immediately go to bed." Maria was a very good and sensible child, and therefore her mother could leave her alone and let her play with her things without anxiety. But for fear she might become so much interested in her new doll and other presents as to forget the lights which burned on the glass case, her mother blew them all out and left only the lamp which hung from the ceiling in the middle of the chamber, and which diffused a soft, pleasant light. "Come in soon, dear Maria, or you will not be up in time tomorrow morning," called her mother as she went up to bed herself. There was something Maria had to do which she had not told her mother, though she knew not the reason why, and as soon as she found herself alone, she went quickly about it. She carried in her arms the wounded Nutcracker, rolled up in her pocket handkerchief. Now she laid him carefully upon the table, unrolled the handkerchief softly, and examined his wound. Nutcracker was very pale, but he still smiled so kindly and sorrowfully that it went straight to Maria's heart. "Oh, Nutcracker, Nutcracker, do not be angry at Brother Fred. He did not mean to be so rough and hurt you so. It is the wild soldier's life with his hussars that has made him a little hard-hearted, but otherwise he's a good fellow, I assure you. Now, I will tend to you very carefully until you're well and merry again. As to fastening your teeth and setting your shoulders, that Godfather Drosselmeier must do. He understands such things." But Maria was scarcely able to finish the sentence, for as she mentioned the name of Drosselmeier, friend Nutcracker made a terribly wry face, and there darted something out of his eyes like a green sparkling flash. Maria was just going to fall into a dreadful fright when, behold, it was the sad smiling face of the honest Nutcracker again, which she saw before her, and knew now that it must be the glare of the lamp which, stirred by the draught, that flared up and distorted the Nutcracker's features so strangely. "Am I not a foolish girl," she said, "to be so easily frightened, and to think that a wooden puppet could make faces at me? But I love the Nutcracker too well, perhaps because he is so droll and so good-tempered. Therefore he shall be taken good care of, as he deserves." With this, Maria took friend Nutcracker in her arms, walked to the glass case, stooped down, and said to her new doll, "Pray, Miss Clara, be as good as to give up your bed to the sick and wounded Nutcracker, and make out as well as you can with the sofa. Remember that you are well and hearty, or you would not have such fat red cheeks, and very few little dolls have such nice sofas." Miss Clara, in her gay Christmas attire, looked very grand and haughty, and would not even say muck. "But why should I stand upon ceremony?" said Maria, and she took out the bed, laid the little Nutcracker down upon it softly, and gently rolled a ribbon upon which she wore around her waist, around his poor shoulders. Then she drew the bedclothes over him snugly, so that there was nothing to be seen of him below the nose. "He shan't stay with the naughty Clara," she said, and raised the bed with the Nutcracker in it to the shelf above, and placed it by the pretty village where Fred's hussars were quartered. She locked the case, and was about to go to bed when, listen now, when softly, softly, it began to rustle and to whisper and to rattle round and round under the hearth, behind the chairs, behind the cupboards and glass. The great clock whirred louder and louder, but it could not strike. Maria turned towards it, and there the large gilt owl that sat on top had dropped down on its wings so that they covered its face, and it stretched out its ugly head with its short, crooked beak, and looked almost like a cat. The clock whirred louder in plain words now. "Dickory, dickory, dock, whir softly clock. Mouse King has a fine ear. The old song let him hear, or he might run away in a fright. Now clock strikes softly and light. And pum-pum, it went with a dull, deadened sound 12 times. Maria began now to tremble, fear, and she was upon the point of running out of the room in terror when she beheld Godfather Drosselmeier, who sat in the owl's place on top of the clock. He had hung down the skirts of his brown coat just like wings, but she took courage and cried out loudly with sobs, "Godfather Drosselmeier, what are you doing up there? Come down and do not frighten me so, you naughty Godfather Drosselmeier." Just then a wild squeaking and whimpering broke out on all sides, and then there was a running, trotting, and galloping behind the walls, as if 1,000 little feet were in motion, and 1,000 little lights flashed out of the crevices. But they were not lights, no, they were sparkling little eyes, and Maria perceived that mice were all about, peeping out and working their way into the room. Presently it went trot, trot, hop, hop about the chamber, and more mice, in greater or smaller parties, galloped across, and at last placed themselves in line and column, just as Fred was accustomed to place his soldiers when they went to battle. This, Maria thought, was very droll, and as she had not had that aversion to mice which most children have, her terror was gradually leaving her, when all at once there arose a squeaking so terrible, so piercing, that it seemed as if ice-cold water were poured down her back. Ah, what now did she see? I know, my dear listener, that thy heart, like that of the wise and brave soldier Frederic sits right in place. But if thou hadst seen what Maria now behold, thou wouldst certainly have run away. Yes, I believe that thou wouldst have jumped as quickly as possible into bed, and then have drawn the covering over thine ears so much further than was necessary to keep thee warm. Alas, poor Maria could not do that now, for, listen now, close before her feet there burst out sand and lime and crumbled wall-stones, as if thrown up by some subterranean force, and 7 mice heads with 7 sparkling crowns rose out of the floor, squeaking and squealing terribly. Presently the mouse's body, to which these 7 heads belonged, worked its way out, and the great mouse, crowned with 7 diadems, squeaking loudly, huzzaed in full chorus as he advanced to meet his army, which at once set itself in motion. And hot, hot, trot, trot it went. Alas, straight toward the glass case, straight towards poor Maria, who stood close before it. Her heart was beating so terribly from fear and anxiety that she knew that she must die, but now it seemed as if the blood stood still in her veins. Half fainting, she tottered backwards when, clatter, rattle, it went, and a glass pane from which she had struck with her elbow fell to pieces at her feet. She felt at the moment a sharp pain in her left arm, but her heart all at once became much lighter. She heard no more squeaking or squealing. All had become still, and although she did not dare to look, she yet believed that the mice, frightened by the clatter of broken glass, had retreated to their holes. But what was that again? Close up behind her in the glass case, a strange bustling and rustling began, and the little fine voices were heard. Up, up, awake, arms take, awake. To the fight this night, up, to the fight. And all the while something rang out clear and sweet, like little bells. Ah, that is my dear musical clock, exclaimed Maria joyfully, and quickly turned to look. She then saw how it flashed and lightened strangely in the glass case, and there was a great stir and bustle upon the shelves. Many little figures crossed up and down each other, and worked and stretched out their arms as if they were making ready. And now Nutcracker raised himself all of a sudden, threw the bedclothes clear off, and leaped with both feet out of the bed, crying aloud, "Crack, crack, crack! Stupid pack! Drive mouse back! Stupid pack! Crack, crack, mouse! Back, crick, crack, stupid pack. With these words, he drew his little sword, flourished it in the air, and exclaimed, "My loving vassals, friends and brothers, will you stand by me in the hard fight?" Straightway 3 scaramouches, a harlequin, 4 chimney sweeps, 2 guitar players, and a drummer cried out, "Yes, my lord, we will follow you with fidelity and courage. We will march with you to battle, to victory or death," and then rushed after the fiery Nutcracker, who ventured the dangerous leap from the upper shelf. It was easy enough for them to perform this feat, for beside the fine garments of thick clothes and silk which they wore, the inside of their bodies were made of cotton and tow, so that they came down plump like bags of wool. But poor Nutcracker had certainly broken his arms or his legs, for remember, it was almost 2 feet from the shelf where he stood to the floor, and his body was as brittle as if it had been out of linden wood. Yes, Nutcracker would have certainly broken his arms or legs, if, at the moment when he leaped, Miss Clara had not sprung quickly from the sofa and caught the hero with his drawn sword in her soft arms. "Ah, thou art dear and good, Clara," sobbed Maria. "How I have wronged thee! Thou didst certainly resign thy bed willingly to the little Nutcracker." But Miss Clara now spoke, as she softly pressed the young hero to her silken bosom. "You will not, oh my lord, sick and wounded as you are, share the dangers of the fight. See how your brave vassals assemble themselves, eager for the fray, and certain of conquest. Scaramouche, harlequin, chimney sweepers, guitar players, drummer, all are ready and drawn up below, and the china figures on the shelf stir and move strangely. Will you not, oh my lord, repose upon the sofa, or, from my arms, look down upon your victory?" Thus spoke Clara, but Nutcracker demeaned himself very ungraciously, for he kicked and struggled so violently with his legs that Clara was obliged to set him free. He then, however, dropped gracefully upon one knee and said, "Fair lady, the recollection of thy favor and condescension will go with me into the battle and the strife." Clara then stooped so low that she could take him by the arm, raised him gently from his knees, took off her bed-sprangled girdle, and was about to throw it across his neck, but little Nutcracker stepped 2 paces backward, laid his hand upon his breast, and said very earnestly, "Not so, fair lady, lavish not thy favors upon me thus, for—" He stopped, sighed heavily, tore off a piece of the ribbon which Maria had bound upon his shoulders, pressed it to his lips, and hung it across him like a scarf, then boldly flourishing his bright little blade, leaped like a bird over the edge of the glass case upon the floor. You understand, my kind and good listeners, that Nutcracker, even before he had thus come to life, had felt very sensibly the kindness and love which Maria had shown towards him, and it was because of this that he had become so partial to her, that he would not receive or wear the girdle of Miss Clara, although it shone and sparkled so brightly. The true and faithful Nutcracker preferred to wear Maria's simple ribbon. But what will happen now? As soon as Nutcracker had leapt out, the squeaking and whistling was heard again. It is under the large table that the hateful mice have concealed their countless bands, and high above them all towers the dreadful mouse with 7 heads. What will happen now?